I've fallen and I can't get up. Hey folks, welcome back. This is Tom, Moto-Resto LLC, Braden, Florida. I'm here with Ichabod the Wonder Dog. We're going to do a video on maintenance and service of the drive shaft on a Concours 14, propeller shaft, whatever you want to call it, on a Concours 14. Ichabod's going to help me here. It's going to be a little bit of a different format video, and I'll explain it here really quick. All right, so about the format. I never actually did shoot some video when I did this service, but I did shoot a lot of high-res DSLR photos. What I'll do is a voiceover or narration of those particular photos. Now, interesting note here, in the service manual, I don't know about the owner's manual, I didn't really look that up, but I seriously doubt it. The service manual shows no service interval, none, for the final drive or drive shaft on this bike. So again, I think this is an important service, even though it's not necessarily listed in the service manual. So let's go ahead and get right to it.
All right, so here's where we get started. Of course, in this particular photo, I have the bike on the lift. This is definitely best suited for having it on a lift or something, but it certainly can be done rather at the ground level. And what I have this shot, of course, is just setting up for removing the rear wheel. Now, just follow the service data for that if you haven't already done it about 50 times. Replacing, rear tires. This thing tends to eat rear tires if you run it a little on the spirited side, as we all know. So just get prepared to remove the rear tire, and then we can move on to the next operation. We're going to have to dislodge the rear brake, of course, like you normally would do. Entire removal. Just a quick note about that rear ABS sensor. Make sure that you disconnect that, or just, don't tug that ABS wire or anything like that. You definitely want to get it in a position in which you'll see here shortly where I have it hung up. And so there's no significant strain on either the wire or the actual brake line. Quick note here about the actual other side of the axle. You see that's a hex. That's actually a 14 millimeter. So you can pick those up anywhere, Harbor Freight, wherever you want. And I'm unsure if the factory tools under the seat have some sort of a combination tool or something to actually get that. And if anybody knows that, they can leave it in the comments. But I actually never tried. I kind of just thought about it when I was doing this. But you're going to need that because you want to properly retorque this axle to the proper torque spec. You're definitely going to need to hold the other side. So just keep that in mind. You really should have the proper tools to do a job like this. Okay, you got the brake caliper all hung up and out of the way and getting ready to pull that rear wheel. And then just get that out of the way, which I'll show you real quick, just in a couple of quick shots. And as far as what you need to do on this side of the bike, that's pretty much it. This is one of the spacers for the rear wheel. Doesn't matter which side it is, and I honestly can't remember. But you want to take a look at those spacers, see those little lines that are worn into them. That's from the actual seal where it rides. A little bit of a line is not a big deal, but if you have one that's really gouged up, you're going to want to replace these because they're just not going to seal right, and you're going to end up eating bearings prematurely. Quick shot of separating the wheel from the differential itself. And, of course, removing the wheel from under the bike where you can get at the other stuff. All right, folks, whenever you pull a wheel, I don't care what it's for, drive shaft, tire change, whatever, always check the bearings. Stick your finger in there, move them around very carefully so you don't cut yourself. You never know it's any sharp edges. I can do a whole separate video on properly seating these bearings, so it's a little bit too much for right now. But you definitely want to check the bearings, check the seals. If you just take the actual spacer that rides in that seal and hold it up to the seal side of the actual hub of the wheel, you can see whether or not it's loose or something. If it's loose, the seals just have to be replaced. There's just no other alternative. So make sure you always check bearings and seals when you remove the wheels from the bike. Got our first shot of the business end of the final drive, the actual differential. You see that big spline articulates with a mating spline on the actual wheel that we saw in the last picture. In the middle of that, and I'm going to show you a little more detail on that here in a second, there's a spacer. Set that spacer aside. It only goes in one way. There's like a tapered end that actually fits into that final drive. You are not looking at that tapered end here. The tapered end is actually inside there. So we're going to deal with these later. I don't necessarily have any pictures of it, but I'm going to go over it in a narrative format really quick about what we do as far as greasing these things up before putting them back together. One of the things that is of concern to some Concours owners is the fact that they see some grease or something coming on the bottom of the differential when they are doing a cleaning or something. And that usually is the large seal that seals off the actual differential to the wheel itself. Not usually the small one that's deeper inside there, but the larger one. And I've read stories about it being more prevalent on certain years and in certain situations. I don't really know. Mine hasn't leaked, but if yours is leaking, you definitely want to have that replaced or replace that seal. Wouldn't be a bad idea to even keep one on hand. And there's that seal right there. I just wanted to give you a close-up of it. That's the one that's going to give you the most problems if you have a leaky differential as far as gear oil goes. So just keep that in mind that, it's easy to get to, it's easy to change. So if you have that situation, either have your dealer or service technician or whoever does your service, be it that somebody else or yourself, change that out as necessary. This shot, I'm removing that spacer. Do not lose it. Again, it only goes in one way. Now, the spacers are really important on any motorcycle, whether it's shaft drive or a chain-driven motorcycle. What the spacers essentially do, and I think a lot of folks out there that do their own work may not exactly understand this, is when you tighten up an axle, what you're actually tightening up on is the spacers. You're not tightening up on anything else. You're going from the one end of the axle bolt, okay, and you're going through whatever you're going through. In this case, it's going to be the final drive and that spacer right there. And then you're going through the wheel hub, which is the bearings, the spacers that are between the bearings, and then out the other side wherever a spacer is, and of course the nut or whatever it is, the bolt, depending on how it's set up, that actually provides that loading torque, or that loading force. So basically the spacers are really, really important. I mention that because I have worked on bikes with a bound up wheel, in particular a front wheel, and when I took the wheel off, there was actually no spacer between the bearings inside the hub. So make sure you don't lose that. Make sure it goes in properly. Grease it up, and that's what it's for, and it's there as designed. You need to have it. Moving up the shaft, right now I'm pulling back that little accordion boot that's more toward the back of the bike. And the reason why is that snaps in right there. We're going to have to swing that down. Essentially, I'll show you that in a second. We're going to end up swinging that whole assembly downwards. And so it's going to separate from that location. You don't want it hanging up. So I just showed a quick picture of popping that boot out and getting it ready for that particular operation. Pop that cap off, and that covers that lower fastener there on the actual back of that swing arm assembly. It's really the swing arm part of it, if you really think about it. It just happens to be half of a final drive rather than a regular traditional swing arm that you see on a chain bike. And that's going to be a pivot point that we use to essentially just lower and swing that final drive out of the way. So I just wanted to, tell you don't need to take it out necessarily. You just need to loosen it up at this point. This be the cap bolt above there that is on what I would, describe as like a torque arm above that boot there, and pretty much straight up from that last shot where you just loosen that bigger one. This needs to come out completely. It is I believe it's an 8 or a 10 millimeter, I can't exactly remember, tool that you need for it. And, Kawasaki uses that kryptonite Loctite. So you got to be careful with it. You can easily round off a cap bolt like that. And you see it's kind of recessed in there, so it'd be very difficult to, chisel out or something. So just take your time with it. And if you need to heat it up a little bit, just be careful with that. And then you can certainly get that out. And once you do, just set it aside, because after that, that thing's going to be able to swing down. And I'll show you here in a second another shot, how that goes. You'll probably need a little tappy tap tap to get that out. So just put the nut back on it loosely, a couple threads even, or whatever you need, and then just give it a couple wraps, because, that's a steel bolt, a shank, and it's inside a bushing. And so if that thing's stuck, you're just going to need to give it a little persuasion, that's all. Once you take that bolt out of that top bushing in the last shot there, this thing will be allowed to slide down, and it's not light. So be very careful and be ready for it to want to drop down. I'm going to try to explain this without butchering it too much. But the reason why you're able to do this is because there's actually two universal joints on this propeller shaft. There's one up front, and there's one back right by the final drive. That's why you're able to kind of angle that spline on the output side of the final drive to the input side of the differential and let this thing drop down. And the reason why, of course, is it has, it's kind of an independent suspension, as it's similar bushings and articulation points on the other side of the wheel as well on that part of the suspension. So it's kind of like, the ball joints on your front wheel of the car that allow the wheel to actually move up and down more straight than just rocking. Like on a, let's say, a 1980s or 90s bike, like a sport bike or something that just has a rigid swing arm with a sprocket and so forth. That rear wheel arcs up and down. This one moves more straighter up and down because of this articulation. So that's why they need another U-joint on the back there. Otherwise, that wouldn't work. So just be careful. Again, it's very heavy, and you'll just drop it down. You can put a couple of blocks of wood underneath there if you don't want it to rest against the limits of that lower bushing, whatever you want to do. And then once that's out of the way, you're good to go to the next operation. By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. When you start disassembling this and you take the rigidity of the wheel away from the two sides of the rear suspension, you'll notice there's some lateral movement, even some twisting movement of those bushings. And that comes up in Facebook pages and forums quite often, actually. That is completely normal for this bike, so absolutely do not panic. They are allowed to wiggle a little bit. It's just the rigidity of the rear wheel in concert with this rear suspension that keeps everything nice and straight. So don't go buying bushings and bearings and things like that if it is able to kind of move and twist a little bit. Again, totally normal. Here's a close-up of that spline that from the drive shaft into the final drive. Now, as you can see, there's pretty much no lubrication on this. Now, this is not lubricated by the actual final drive gear oil. Some are set up where they actually do. But there is an O-ring, and you can kind of just barely see it as you move your way up toward that U-joint that seals that off essentially from outside elements. There's a coupler that this mates up with that actually is part of the final drive, but there's a larger area you'll see on the end of that final drive, or I should say the input side of the final drive, that has an oil seal around it. That's what actually keeps the gear oil inside the final drive. So there's also a spring that goes up inside that end of that drive shaft. It'll either be stuck in there or it'll be actually in the coupler, usually in the coupler itself. So just make sure that's there. And what that just does is keeps longitudinal force up against the drive shaft, so it's always pushing up toward the motor. And then, it allows it to lengthen and shorten as necessary, depending on the position of the actual suspension, in deflection and extension. So basically, you're going to need to lubricate that. And we'll go over the lubrication here in a little bit, but just an example, I didn't wipe that down first, that when it comes out, not a whole lot of lubrication on it. It's difficult to see, but I can tell you that there was just a very small hint of grease on that particular spline. Up toward the front now we go, and we need to get this plate out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and show you another shot with the actual bolts marked with some yellow tape to show you exactly which ones you need to take out. And here they are all marked. Now there's, what is there, 5 there. The one that's farthest right that attaches to the actual subframe, that one on my bike was so tight that the bolt got completely destroyed getting it out. I ended up having to chisel that out using heat, the whole bit. So it's another one of these deals where, you put their cap, hex cap bolts, but or button head in this case. But the trouble is, sometimes they are just so tight because of that kryptonite Loctite and corrosion and so forth that takes place to similar metal stuff. So what you want to do is just take your time, use good practice operations to get those out. But all 5 absolutely need to be removed. Unfortunately, this isn't the best shot, but what you need to do now is you need to take a small pair of pliers like wire cutters and get in there and essentially dislodge that retainer for the band clamp that goes over that front accordion rubber cover, so you can disconnect that, because you need to push that out of the way and do another operation, which we'll cover here shortly. Now, I was able just to reuse it. If you're really careful, all you need to do is just pop that and it'll come loose. And it's not terribly tight. So it's not like a CV axle one where you got to pull the thing, to bejesus limits. But so just be careful. Worst case scenario, you're going to have to order an aftermarket solution to it. Or you can order OEM and just get a proper tool for it. But again, I was able to reuse it without any trouble. That rubber accordion cover I just referenced partially fits over this side cover. This comes out really easy. You'll see the bolts for it. It just covers up the side of the drive shaft, and you can see the whole thing once you pop this cover off. So take the fasteners off that hold this cover on and just separate it and set it aside. And this here is what you get when you take that off. So you see we have the rubber cover, that accordion cover, dislodged and able to move to and fro, and we've got that plastic side cover off. So you can look at that scrawny little drive shaft. It looks a heck of a lot bigger from the side with the cover on now, doesn't it? Now we're going to remove the drive shaft. So we move that boot toward the rear to access that collar. You can see it is a spinny part. It's attached to the drive shaft, and you see the little hole. We're going to want to position that hole so you have the bike in neutral. You can do that to at least 9 o'clock, preferably 10, 11 o'clock in orientation, not pointing down. I'll show you why here in a second. But you want it at least that way. I have it in this photo, or at least a little bit higher even, pointed upwards. You don't want this thing going to get lost if you do it any other way. Trust me on this, because that's a pin inside there with a spring behind it, and it detents into that hole, but there's nothing that retains the pin inside where it lives in the drive shaft, which I'll show you here in a minute. Another quick shot of that hole with my dirty finger pointing toward it, and I'll zoom up on this here so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And again, clock this sideways or above, not downwards. Now I shove something into the small hole. Must be a joke there somewhere. In this case, I use a small Allen wrench. And behind that collar that you can see starting to move, which is part of the drive shaft, you will see that there's going to be a hole, and a pin goes inside that hole, which is why you have to have this clocked sideways or upwards. Because if you didn't, and it was pointed downwards, as soon as you release that, it is going to fall right out, because again, it's not detented inside there. So just very carefully slide it back, and then you'll see that there's a pin with a spring behind it. Here is where that spring and pin live, and I don't have an actual shot of the pin of the spring for some reason. I don't know why, but it doesn't really matter anyway, because you're going to see it. It just is like a machine pin and a spring behind it. And so as you slide that off, it's not like it's a real, boingy spring or something where it's going to fly across the room like carburetor springs or something. It's just a gentle spring that keeps that pin outwards and locked into where it's supposed to live with that coupler. So just be careful of it. When you take it out, set it aside and make sure you don't lose it. But that is where it lives. This is a shot of the spline side that actually mates with the output shaft side on the bike itself. That would be the driven side right here, the one you're looking at on the screen. And you can see again, that spline is just not very well lubricated. All right, it's just not a whole lot of grease in there. Right at the top of it there, and I'll zoom in here to show you. It's not a great picture, I apologize, but you can see that hole that we push through to release the pin that lives in the other hole. And it's actually a dowel pin. Kawasaki calls it a roll pin, but there's no indication of the spring on the actual parts fish. But it's definitely held in with a little spring. So you just have to make sure that you don't lose any parts like that. So I just wanted to kind of show you this example of why this maintenance may be needed from time to time. So once it's all apart, you grease her up and then put it back together. Reassembly is simply reverse of disassembly, and just follow the service manual, and that'll tell you how to do it step by step, as well as what I'm covering here. So I just wanted to show you two pictures. The first one is making sure that you have that rubber boot clocked properly. It has those two little pins that tab goes between. Otherwise, it doesn't want to fit right. The other is this shot. I'm getting ready to swing that differential back up into place, and I got the spline greased. And we'll, again, cover the grease thing on the outro. And you see that spring I was talking about before? I already shoved that in and getting ready for swinging it up. This is not the easiest chore in the world to get this thing to line up, because that final drive is heavy. If you have a helper, I'd recommend that, because you got one trying to manipulate the drive shaft end, the loose end, because there's a U-joint right there, and then you got another person that can actually spin the innards of the differential and get this input side to line up with that spline. So it'll put a little bit of fight up, but it's a hell of a lot easier than disconnecting the whole thing. You don't need to. You just need to swing it down and then back up.
All right, so that's about it. I wanted to cover a couple of really quick things briefly. This is not necessarily how to do it. This is how I do it. There is service data in the service manual on this. There is not a service interval listed in the maintenance schedule, as I indicated earlier. But there is guidance on how to remove the final drive, how to remove the propeller shaft, and what to use for lubricants and so forth. Speaking of that, what I like to use for lube in these kind of situations is a product like this. Wrong one. molybdenum grease. I can never say that. Molybdenum disulfide grease, moly grease. This is a Yamalu brand, not necessarily recommended, not a sponsor. This is just one that I got online a while back, and it's a pretty big tube, and it's lasted a long time. You definitely want to use the sticky grease. This is like CV joint grease, same thing on splines like that. Any fast spinny part that you want the grease to stay on, that's what you need to use. I'm pretty sure the service manual says to use the moly bit of grease there. Okay. Yeah. Follow the service data if you need to do this. By the way, if you need some help with this, reach out to me. I'll be glad to give you some advice on it. It's been a long time since I did it, which is why maybe it's a little bit scatterbrained in here. And another reason why I don't have any video on it. I mean, there was no trailer hitch on the back of the bike. I've had that on for a couple of years. So I did those pictures and did this service a while back. So if you like what you see, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel. Like the video, it definitely helps. So ring the bell, you get notified when I put up some more content. So till next time, I got to go out onto the mower now, the sleek black beauty that I have a video on, and cut some grass. As I always sign off with now, don't just repair, restore. Catch you on the next video.